Hey everyone, Mr. Terror here. I want to start by saying a huge thank you for stopping by. It's incredible to know that we have viewers from all corners of the globe, and I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your part of the world? Drop your answers in the comments below, along with any highlights from your day so far. I'll be hanging out in the comments section, reacting to your messages, so don't be shy. Make sure to watch until the end. I always save the best stories for last. If you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means so much and helps this community grow. Now, without further delay, let's dive into today's story. Let me start by saying I've always been cautious when it comes to online dating. I'm the type who double-checks someone's profile, scours their photos for inconsistencies, and even does a little Googling before agreeing to meet. You could call me paranoid, but in this day and age, you have to be. Or at least I thought I was being cautious until I met Eric. Eric was perfect. Tall, charming, a little nerdy but in a cute way, and his profile made him seem like the kind of guy who had his life together. We matched on a dating app a few weeks ago, and right from the start, his messages stood out. He wasn't the usual "hey" or "what's up" guy. Instead, his opening line was about my favorite book, which I'd listed in my bio. He said, "Do you think the ending of The Night Circus was too open-ended, or does the mystery make it better?" I mean, how could I not respond to that? Our conversations flowed easily. We talked about everything: books, movies, our favorite restaurants. He told me he was a chef, which immediately caught my attention. Food is my love language, and the idea of dating someone who could whip up a gourmet meal sounded like a dream come true. After about 2 weeks of chatting, he asked me out to dinner. He insisted on cooking for me at his place, saying, "If I'm going to impress you, it should be with what I do best." Now, I know what you're thinking. Red flag, right? Meeting at his house for a first date? Normally, I'd agree. But Eric was different. He seemed safe, genuine, and so thoughtful. He even sent me his address days before the date, along with a link to a social media profile I'd already stalked, just to reassure me. Looking back, that level of reassurance should have been my first clue. Something was off. When the night of the date arrived, I was nervous but excited. Eric's apartment was in a nice part of town, in one of those modern complexes with floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek, minimalist design. When I got there, he greeted me at the door with a warm smile and a bottle of wine. He looked even better in person, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and wearing a simple black button-up that fit him perfectly. "Wow," he said, his eyes lighting up. "You're even prettier than your photos." I blushed, muttering something awkward about how he looked great too. The apartment smelled amazing, like garlic and fresh herbs, and he had a small table set up with candles and place settings. It was clear he'd gone all out to make the evening special. "I hope you like surprises," he said as he poured me a glass of wine, "because tonight's menu is a little unconventional." "Unconventional?" I asked with a laugh. "That sounds mysterious." "You'll love it," he replied, his smile lingering just a little too long. The first course was a small plate of something he called crispy bone marrow tartare. I hesitated for a moment. Bone marrow wasn't something I'd usually order, but Eric was so enthusiastic about it that I didn't want to seem ungrateful. The dish was surprisingly good, rich, and buttery, and Eric watched me intently as I took my first bite. "See? I knew you'd be adventurous," he said, his tone almost proud. As we ate, the conversation was easy and fun. He told me about his job as a private chef and his love for creating unique dishes. I asked about his favorite cuisines, and he shared stories of traveling to obscure parts of Europe to learn local recipes. He was fascinating, and for a while I forgot to feel uneasy. But then, as we finished the first course, he asked me something that caught me off guard. "Have you ever thought about the idea of consuming something forbidden?" he said, swirling his wine glass as he spoke. I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. Forbidden? Like what? Blowfish or something? He smiled but didn't answer, instead standing to retrieve the next course. The second dish was a stew, dark, rich, and aromatic. Eric placed the bowl in front of me, his eyes practically glowing with excitement. "This," he said, "is one of my signature dishes. It's an old recipe I picked up in the Balkans, a little secret of mine." I took a bite, and it was incredible. The flavors were deep and complex, unlike anything I'd ever tasted before. But as I ate, I noticed something odd. There was a small piece of meat on my spoon that didn't look quite normal. It was darker than the rest, almost black, with a strange texture. "What kind of meat is this?" I asked casually, trying to mask my unease. Eric paused for a beat, then smiled. "That's the surprise. Don't worry, it's perfectly safe. Just something you'd never find at your average restaurant." His response didn't exactly comfort me, but I forced myself to keep eating. I didn't want to ruin the night or seem ungrateful, especially when he'd put so much effort into the meal. Still, a small voice in the back of my mind told me something wasn't right. After dinner, Eric offered to show me his collection of travel photos. We moved to the living room, where he pulled out a leather-bound photo album. The pictures were beautiful: landscapes, markets, street food stalls. But as he flipped through the pages, I noticed something strange. In almost every photo, there was a person in the background staring directly at the camera. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but the more I looked, the more deliberate it seemed. The people weren't smiling or interacting with the scene. They were just watching. "Who are they?" I asked, pointing to one of the photos. Eric looked down at the image and smiled faintly. "Oh, just locals. They were curious about my camera, I think." His tone was casual, but there was something unsettling about the way he said it, like he wasn't telling the whole truth. By the time I left his apartment that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eric had been charming, attentive, and the perfect host, but there were too many little things that didn't add up. The strange questions, the mysterious meat, the people in the photos. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I was just nervous because it was our first date, but as I got into my car and glanced back at his apartment window, I saw him standing there watching me leave, and he was smiling. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The dinner date had been amazing on the surface. Eric was thoughtful, intelligent, and charming, but something about the night didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the stew, or the odd way he dodged my question about the meat. Or maybe it was those photos, with their strange unblinking faces in the background. I told myself to let it go. Eric was probably just eccentric, and I was reading too much into things. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. So, like any modern detective, I turned to the internet. Eric didn't have much of a digital footprint. His social media accounts were sparse, mostly pictures of food, travel snapshots, and a few selfies. Nothing overtly alarming. But something about the lack of detail struck me as odd. For a guy who claimed to be a private chef with an impressive resume, there wasn't much online to back it up. No mentions of clients, no reviews, no professional portfolio. I dug deeper, searching his name along with the city he'd said he worked in. That's when I stumbled across something strange. A Reddit thread from about 2 years ago mentioned a man named Eric who matched his description, a charming chef who hosted private dinner parties. But the thread wasn't singing his praises, it was warning people to stay away. The post was written by someone who claimed to have attended one of Eric's dinner parties. The author described a similar experience to mine: a beautiful apartment, gourmet food, and a magnetic host who made you feel like the center of the universe. But halfway through the evening, they'd felt sick, lightheaded and nauseous, almost like they'd been drugged. They'd left early, but what scared them the most was what they found later. Eric had been using a fake name. The police didn't take their concerns seriously, but the post ended with a chilling warning. If you meet him, run. Don't eat the food. Don't drink the wine. Just leave. I didn't know what to think. Was it the same Eric? Maybe it was just a coincidence. But the description was too close for comfort. My instincts told me to cut off contact, but a part of me needed answers. I wanted to believe the man I'd met wasn't a predator. So when Eric texted me later that afternoon, asking if I wanted to meet again, I hesitated. He suggested a casual lunch at a nearby cafe, and I agreed, partly out of curiosity, partly out of fear. At least it was a public place. When I arrived, he was already there, smiling as if nothing was wrong. He kissed me on the cheek and pulled out a chair for me. For a moment, I felt like I was overreacting. He seemed so normal, but as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me too closely. His questions were just a little too personal, like he was trying to extract something from me. And when I mentioned the Reddit post, his demeanor shifted. "Eric," I said, forcing a casual tone, "I came across something online about a chef who sounded a lot like you. Have you ever hosted private dinner parties?" His smile froze for a fraction of a second before he laughed it off. "Private parties? Not really. I cook for clients sometimes, but it's nothing formal. Why do you ask?" I shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant. "No reason, just curious." But his reaction told me everything I needed to know. He was hiding something. Later that evening, I went back to the Reddit thread and started combing through the comments. One caught my attention. Someone had mentioned that Eric always left a specific signature behind at his parties, a small carved figurine, usually hidden somewhere in the house or apartment of his guests. It was an inside joke, the commenter said, meant to symbolize his mark on the evening. My heart sank. I thought back to the dinner at his apartment and the table decor. There had been a small wooden figure sitting next to the candles, a grotesque carving of a human face, distorted and grinning. At the time, I'd assumed it was just a quirky decoration, but now I wasn't so sure. I needed to know more. I couldn't let it go. The more I thought about the figurine, the more unsettled I felt. My brain kept replaying every detail of that night at Eric's apartment, the way he dodged my questions, the eerie photos, and the strange meat in the stew. It all felt connected, but I couldn't quite piece it together. That night, I made a decision. I was going to confront Eric, but this time I wanted the upper hand. If he was hiding something, I needed proof. I called him and told him I'd love to come over for another dinner. To my surprise, he seemed thrilled. The date was set for the following evening. Before heading to his place, I made some preparations. I shared my location with a close friend and told her everything. I even sent her the link to the Reddit thread. If I didn't text her every hour, she was to call the police. I also brought along a small audio recorder, tucked discreetly into my bag. I didn't know what I was expecting, but if anything suspicious happened, I wanted evidence. When I arrived, Eric greeted me with his usual charm. His smile was warm, his voice smooth, and for a moment I almost forgot why I was there. The apartment looked just as I remembered it, tasteful, elegant, and slightly too perfect. "Tonight's menu is special," he said, leading me to the dining table. "I've been saving this recipe for someone who truly appreciates good food." The table was set with precision, and in the center was a covered dish. My stomach churned. I didn't want to eat anything he served, but I had to play along. As Eric busied himself in the kitchen, I discreetly began searching the apartment. I checked the bookshelves, the coffee table, even the drawers in the sideboard. That's when I found it, a small wooden box tucked away on a lower shelf. Inside were several carved figurines, each one more grotesque than the last. Some were human faces, others were animals, but all had the same twisted, unsettling quality. Before I could react, Eric's voice came from behind me. "Looking for something?" I spun around, heart pounding. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I was just admiring these carvings," I stammered, holding up one of the figurines. "Did you make these?" He stepped closer, his smile returning. "I did. Each one tells a story, you know. A memory, a moment, a person." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "They're unique. Who are they for?" "For my guests," he said simply. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time I saw something dark behind his charming facade. Eric led me back to the dining table where the covered dish waited. He poured us each a glass of wine and sat across from me. With a flourish, he lifted the lid to reveal the meal, a stew much like the one he'd served before. The rich aroma filled the room, but this time it made my stomach turn. "Go ahead," he said, gesturing to my plate. "You'll love it." I hesitated, staring at the dark chunks of meat swimming in the broth. "What's in it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "An old family recipe," he replied, taking a sip of his wine. "The meat is unique. Hard to find." My mind raced. I thought of the figurines, the Reddit thread, and the way Eric had watched me so intently during our first dinner. A horrifying thought crept into my mind, but I pushed it aside. It couldn't be. I pretended to take a bite, but the moment he looked away, I spit it into a napkin. My goal was to keep him talking, to buy time while I figured out a way to leave. "Eric," I said, "you're so talented. These carvings, your cooking, it's incredible. But I have to ask, why don't you share more about yourself online? Someone as skilled as you should be famous." He leaned back, his smile fading slightly. "I like my privacy. The world doesn't need to know everything about me." His evasiveness only fueled my suspicion. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to tip him off. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my friend checking in. Eric's eyes flicked toward the sound. "Expecting someone?" he asked, his tone sharper now. I forced a laugh. "Just a friend. She worries about me when I go on dates." Eric's expression darkened, and for a moment I thought I saw anger flash in his eyes. "You told someone about me?" The air in the room grew heavy. I knew I had to leave, now. Eric's question hung in the air, a weight pressing down on me. "You told someone about me?" He repeated, his tone icy. I forced another laugh, trying to diffuse the tension. "Of course," I said lightly. "I mean, isn't that what people do these days? You tell your friends about your dates. It's normal." Eric didn't respond. His gaze bore into me, and for the first time I felt genuinely afraid. The warmth and charm he'd radiated earlier were gone, replaced by something colder, something dangerous. As I reached for my wine glass, I noticed my hands trembling. I needed an excuse to leave. "I just realized I left my wallet in my car," I said, standing up. "I'll be right back." Eric's expression didn't change. "You don't need it. Stay. Enjoy the meal." The way he said it wasn't a request. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed toward the door, forcing a smile. "No, really, I'll only be a second." Then he stood, blocking my path. "You don't trust me, do you?" The words hit me like a punch. I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could speak, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm, almost crushing. "You were never going to stay, were you?" I yanked my arm away and bolted for the door, but Eric was faster. He slammed it shut, trapping me inside. My mind raced as I scanned the room for anything I could use as a weapon. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. Eric's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You were perfect," he said, his voice almost tender. "But you ruined it. You had to snoop, had to question everything." I grabbed a chair and swung it at him. It hit his shoulder, causing him to stumble back. I didn't wait for him to recover. I ran toward the kitchen, hoping to find a knife or something sharp. But Eric was right behind me. He tackled me to the ground, pinning me down. "You don't understand," he hissed, his breath hot against my ear. "This isn't about you. It's about the process. The art in the struggle. I managed to kick him off me and crawl toward a cabinet. I flung it open, hoping for anything that could help me. Instead, what I found made my blood run cold. Inside were jars, dozens of them. Each one was labeled with a name, and inside were pieces of... I didn't want to think about it. Fingers, teeth, bits of flesh preserved in some kind of liquid. My stomach turned as I realized what the unique meat in his stew had been. I gagged, the bile rising in my throat. Eric was a cannibal, and I'd almost become his next meal. Fueled by adrenaline, I grabbed one of the jars and hurled it at him. It shattered against his chest, the liquid soaking his shirt. While he recoiled in shock, I scrambled to my feet and grabbed a knife from the counter. "Stay back!" I screamed, brandishing the blade. Eric hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk out of here?" he snarled. "You think anyone will believe you?" "I don't care," I spat. "I just want to get out." Keeping the knife between us, I inched toward the door. Eric didn't move, but his eyes followed my every step. When I reached the door, I flung it open and ran as fast as I could. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. I drove straight to the police station and told them everything. At first they seemed skeptical, but when they searched Eric's apartment, they found the jars, the figurines, and more evidence than I ever could have imagined. He'd been targeting women through dating apps for years, using his charm to lure them in before turning them into his twisted art. Even after his arrest, I couldn't shake the nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice. The media dubbed him the dinner date killer, and his story became a sensation. But the part that haunts me the most? When they questioned him, he said something chilling. "She was the one that got away, but I'll find her again. I always do." I moved to a new city, changed my number, and deleted every dating app from my phone. But sometimes, late at night, I think I see him. A figure in the distance, watching, waiting, and I wonder, is he out there, planning his next move? Or is it just my imagination? The night I met Daniel on the dating app, everything felt off. It wasn't the usual unease that comes with swiping through strangers' profiles or nervously hoping the person you've matched with isn't a creep. This felt different, like the faintest whiff of smoke before the fire reveals itself. Daniel's profile stood out immediately. His bio was surprisingly bare. Adventurer, reader, ask me anything. His photos were unremarkable. A mix of travel shots, a candid smile at a park, and a picture of him holding a cat. He seemed normal. Too normal. That should have been my first red flag, but I ignored it. Normalcy is rare on dating apps, so when he messaged me almost immediately, I decided to reply. His first question wasn't, "Hey, how are you?" or even something witty about my profile. Instead, he typed, "Do you like big black dicks?" I laughed out loud. The sheer absurdity caught me off guard. It was so direct, so crass, yet somehow it made me curious. I'm not usually one to entertain such forwardness, but something about it made me hesitate. I thought about ghosting him, but my fingers betrayed me, and I replied, "That's quite the opener. Is this a serious question, or just your way of breaking the ice?" He responded almost instantly, "A little of both. It's an honest question. I like honest people." The conversation that followed was surprisingly engaging, even charming. Daniel was quick-witted, funny, and had a knack for making you feel like the center of the universe. I almost forgot about his bizarre opening line. By the time he asked to meet up, I'd already convinced myself he wasn't as weird as he seemed. We agreed to meet at a trendy bar downtown. The night of the date, I remember staring at myself in the mirror, second-guessing everything. My outfit, my makeup, even the decision to go. But the curiosity was too strong. I had to know who this guy really was. When I walked into the bar, he was already there, seated in a dim corner booth, nursing what looked like an old-fashioned. He waved me over, and as I approached, I felt the first pang of unease. Daniel was handsome, almost too handsome. The kind of looks that seemed curated, like he belonged in an ad campaign. But it wasn't his looks that unsettled me. It was his eyes. They were dark, sharp, and unflinching, like they were cataloging every detail about me the moment I sat down. "Hi," he said, his voice smooth and warm, like melted caramel. "I'm glad you came." I smiled nervously, muttering something about how I almost didn't. The first hour of our date went surprisingly well. He told me about his job, something vague about consulting, and his love for obscure novels. He asked me about my interests, my family, even my childhood. He was attentive, leaning in as I spoke, his gaze never breaking from mine. And then, just as I was starting to feel comfortable, he said something that made my skin crawl. "Have you ever wondered how much someone can hide behind a smile?" I blinked, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" I asked. He swirled the ice in his drink, staring at it like it held the answers to life's mysteries. "People wear masks every day. We smile, laugh, and pretend we're something we're not. But sometimes the mask slips, and when it does, you see what's really underneath." There was a long pause. His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the tension. "Well, I hope your mask doesn't slip tonight," I joked. He looked up at me then, his smile slow and deliberate. "Maybe it already has." The rest of the night was a blur. I remember him paying for our drinks, walking me to my car, and insisting I text him when I got home. Despite the strange moment earlier, I couldn't deny that I felt drawn to him. There was something magnetic about Daniel, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But as I drove home, that feeling of unease crept back in. His words replayed in my mind. "Maybe it already has." I shook it off, convincing myself I was overthinking. After all, dating is weird. People say strange things when they're nervous, right? That night, as I climbed into bed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "I had a great time tonight. Let's do it again soon. Sleep tight." I smiled, but my stomach twisted. Something about him didn't feel right, and yet I couldn't stop myself from replying, "Me too. Let's..." The second date happened faster than I expected. Daniel texted me the next morning with a plan. Dinner at an intimate, hole-in-the-wall Italian place on the edge of the city. It was the kind of spot that didn't show up on Yelp, a word-of-mouth treasure. I hesitated, my gut still processing the weirdness from our first meeting, but curiosity won out again. When I arrived, Daniel was already waiting by the entrance, leaning casually against the brick wall. His smile disarmed me instantly. Gone were the cryptic comments and unsettling undertones from the other night. He was charming, attentive, and funny. For a while, I let myself believe I was just being paranoid. Dinner was flawless. He ordered wine, joked with the waiter, and asked me questions that made me feel interesting, even captivating. By the time dessert rolled around, I was laughing more than I had in weeks. He reached across the table to take my hand, and I didn't pull away. "You're incredible," he said, his voice low and sincere. I blushed. It was the kind of compliment that felt genuine, not rehearsed. As we left the restaurant, Daniel suggested a walk. The night was cool and quiet, the streets bathed in the amber glow of streetlights. I felt at ease until he brought up the question again. "You never answered my first question, you know," he said, his tone light but teasing. "What question?" I asked, genuinely caught off guard. His grin widened. "About big black dicks." I laughed nervously, brushing it off. "I thought we moved past that." He stopped walking, turning to face me. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes searching mine. "You'd be surprised how much you can learn about someone from how they answer that kind of question." The unease returned, creeping up my spine like a cold draft. I tried to laugh again, but it came out forced. What exactly are you trying to learn about me? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, but it sent a chill through me. People lie, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Even to themselves, especially to themselves. I like to see who's willing to confront the truth. The words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Daniel smiled again, his charming facade snapping back into place as if the moment hadn't happened. He walked me to my car, kissed me on the cheek, and told me he'd call. I smiled and waved as I drove off, but my mind was racing. Over the next week, Daniel texted me constantly. At first I was flattered. His messages were sweet, thoughtful, and sometimes downright poetic. But as the days passed, his attention started to feel suffocating. If I didn't reply within minutes, he'd follow up with another message. Are you okay? Busy day? Did I say something wrong? It wasn't just the frequency, it was the tone. There was a quiet intensity to his words, like he was always teetering on the edge of something darker. One night, I mentioned I had plans with friends. His response was immediate. What friends? The question felt invasive, but I brushed it off. Just some old coworkers, I replied. Daniel didn't text back for hours. When he finally did, his message was unsettling. Be careful who you trust. Some people don't have your best interests at heart. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Was he warning me about my friends, or was this about him? The third date wasn't my idea, but Daniel had a way of persuading me. He invited me to his apartment for a home-cooked meal. I almost declined, but a part of me wanted to see where he lived, to gather more clues about who he really was. His apartment was immaculate. Too immaculate. The walls were bare, the furniture minimalistic, and everything felt sterile, like a showroom instead of a home. There were no family photos, no personal touches, just an unsettling emptiness. Dinner was delicious, but the atmosphere felt heavy. Daniel was quieter than usual, his attention laser-focused on me. At one point, he reached across the table to hold my hand, his grip just a little too tight. You trust me, don't you? He asked, his voice low and serious. I hesitated. I think so, I replied, though it sounded more like a question. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Good, that's important. After dinner, he insisted on showing me his collection. I followed him down a narrow hallway to a locked door. He produced a key from his pocket, turning to me with that same unsettling smile. You're going to love this, he said. The door creaked open, revealing a small room lined with shelves. At first glance, it looked like a library, but as I stepped closer, I realized the shelves weren't filled with books. They were filled with boxes. Dozens of identical black boxes, each labeled with a name and a date. What is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel stepped behind me, his presence towering. Memories, he said simply. Pieces of the people I've known, people I've cared about. I reached for one of the boxes, but his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. His grip was firm, almost painful. Not yet, he said, his smile never wavering. You're not ready. That night, I left his apartment feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. I wanted to block his number, to pretend none of this had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel wasn't someone you simply walked away from. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed. You're special. You know that, right? I didn't reply. I didn't sleep that night. The image of those black boxes stayed with me, replaying in my mind on a loop. Memories, Daniel had called them, pieces of people. The cryptic words felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve, and yet I couldn't stop myself from trying. The next morning, I resolved to create some distance. I needed space to think, to figure out whether I was overreacting or if Daniel was truly dangerous. When he texted me that day, I ignored him. For hours, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Good morning. Did I do something wrong? Talk to me, please. You can't just disappear on me. By the evening, the messages stopped. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I got ready for bed, my phone buzzed again, this time with a picture. It was me, sitting in my car, taken from a distance. My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, my breath hitching as another text followed. I don't like being ignored. Panic surged through me. I locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and turned off the lights, praying he wouldn't show up. The next few days passed in a haze. I avoided going out, jumping at every shadow, every unexpected sound. When Daniel's text stopped entirely, it felt like a blessing and a curse, but the peace didn't last. One night, I came home to find my apartment door ajar. My stomach dropped. I stood in the hallway, frozen, before slowly pushing the door open. The living room was untouched, the furniture exactly as I'd left it, but then I saw it. On the coffee table sat a single black box. My hands trembled as I approached it, every instinct screaming at me to run. The box was unlabeled, its surface smooth and cold to the touch. I hesitated before lifting the lid, my heart pounding in my ears. Inside was a stack of Polaroids. The first was of me, taken on our first date. I was smiling, completely oblivious. The next showed me at the restaurant from our second date, my head tilted in laughter. Photo after photo, the timeline of our brief relationship unfolded in stark detail, moments I didn't even realize he'd captured. The final photo stopped me cold. It was me, asleep in my bed. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. An officer arrived within minutes, but by then the box was gone. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "Of course I didn't imagine it," I snapped. The officer sighed, scribbling something in his notebook. "We'll file a report, but without evidence, there's not much we can do." As he left, I felt a sinking realization. I was on my own. Desperation drove me to dig into Daniel's life. His social media accounts were sparse, his online presence practically non-existent. But after hours of searching, I found an old forum post linked to his email address. The thread was about dating horror stories. Among the comments, one stood out, a user describing a man who matched Daniel's description almost perfectly. "He asked the weirdest questions," the comment read. "Kept pushing me to admit things I didn't want to talk about. I tried to break it off, but he wouldn't let me. One night, he showed up at my apartment with this box, said it was a gift. I moved across the country the next day. My blood ran cold. I reached out to the commenter, but their account had been inactive for years. Still, the story confirmed my worst fears. Daniel was dangerous, and I had no idea how far he'd go. The turning point came a week later. I was walking home from work, the sun already dipping below the horizon, when I felt it. Someone was following me. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder. A dark figure trailed me, staying just far enough to keep out of reach. My mind raced. Should I run? Call for help? Before I could decide, the figure stepped into the light. It wasn't Daniel. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. She stopped a few feet away, her expression haunted. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "He won't stop until he owns you." My throat went dry. "What are you talking about?" She looked around nervously, as if expecting him to appear at any moment. "I was where you are now. He makes you think it's love, but it's not. It's control, obsession." I opened my mouth to ask more, but the woman shook her head, backing away. "Get out while you still can," she whispered before disappearing into the shadows. That night, I packed a bag. I didn't care where I went. Anywhere was better than staying. As I threw clothes into my suitcase, my phone buzzed with a text. "You're making a mistake." My hand shook as I typed a reply. "Leave me alone." Seconds later, another text came through. It's too late for that. I dropped the phone and bolted for the door. I didn't know where I was going. I just had to get away. The shadows of the night seemed to stretch further with every step I took, the weight of Daniel's obsession closing in. But something deep inside, told me that running wouldn't be enough. As I hurried down the street, a sudden thought hit me. What if he knew? What if he was watching me right now, waiting for me to make a move? I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. The night was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Then it came, a vibration in my pocket. I hesitated before pulling my phone out, my hands clammy with sweat. The message from Daniel was brief. I know where you are. I froze. The message made my blood run cold. How could he possibly know? I had been so careful, so deliberate in my movements. Just then the phone buzzed again. A photo. My heart stopped as I stared at the image. The front door of the building I had just left. He was already there. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted toward the nearest subway station, desperate to get as far away from that place as possible. But the more I ran, the more I felt like I was running in circles. Every street I turned onto seemed unfamiliar. Every face I passed seemed to hold a hint of recognition, a fleeting glance that made me think he was everywhere. As I reached the station, I checked my phone again. No more messages from Daniel, just silence. I boarded the train, hoping to disappear into the crowd, but the nagging thought never left me. What if he's still following me? Hours passed, and I arrived in a different part of the city, away from my apartment, away from everything. I found a hotel and checked in, locking the door behind me with a sense of false relief. The room was small and sterile, but it was mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of control. But peace was fleeting. The phone buzzed again, and this time I wasn't sure I wanted to see it, but curiosity got the best of me, and I unlocked it to find a single line of text. I've been patient, but you're running out of time. The words sent a chill through me, colder than anything I had felt before. I scanned the room, half expecting to see Daniel standing there, grinning with that unsettling smile, but no one was there. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. I had been playing along, running and hiding, hoping for a sign, a break. But now it felt like I was trapped in some twisted game, one where the rules were made up as I went along. I couldn't keep living like this. I had to confront him. I had to put an end to it. The next morning I called the police again. They still weren't taking me seriously. They had no physical evidence, no real leads, nothing to prove I wasn't just imagining things. They told me to be cautious, to stay in touch, but there was no real urgency in their voices. Frustrated, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I tracked down Daniel's address. He hadn't been entirely careful about hiding his life from the internet. There it was, listed in a public directory. I wasn't sure if it was a good idea, but I had no other choice. I had to see him, confront him, find out what the hell was going on. I arrived at his place just before sunset. It was an apartment building in a quiet part of town, a place that looked too normal to belong to someone like him. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door, unsure of what I would find on the other side. I rang the bell and waited, my breath shallow and rapid. The door opened. It wasn't Daniel. The woman who answered the door looked exhausted, her eyes red and puffy, as if she hadn't slept in days. She stared at me for a moment, as if confused, before her expression shifted to something darker. "Are you here for him?" she asked, her voice tight. I nodded, barely able to speak. I need to talk to Daniel." She shook her head, her lips trembling. "You don't understand. He's not who you think he is." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" She glanced over her shoulder as if making sure no one else was around. "You need to leave. You don't want to get involved with him. He's dangerous. I didn't know it at first. but I found out the hard way. Her words sent a wave of dread through me, but before I could ask more, a voice came from inside the apartment. "Who is it, Claire?" It was Daniel. His voice was calm, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to leave, but the woman grabbed my arm, pulling me back into the apartment. "Get in here," she whispered urgently. "You don't have much time." I was about to protest, but before I could speak, the door slammed shut behind me, cutting off any escape. I was trapped. I still remember the day we matched. It felt like one of those moments that you could almost see coming, but never really expected. Her name was Sarah, a 26-year-old brunette, with a smile that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. We had talked a bit through Tinder, simple exchanges at first, nothing too deep, but after a couple of days things started to flow naturally. Her texts were quick, witty, and she seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We clicked almost immediately. We had plans to meet on the weekend, a cute little cafe downtown, nothing fancy, just coffee and conversation. We swapped numbers, and the text turned into something more personal. I remember telling her about my love for hiking, and she shared her passion for photography. It was effortless. I hadn't been on Tinder long, and to be honest, I was used to the usual ghosting that came with the app. But Sarah was different. She seemed real. I thought I might actually have found someone worth pursuing. The excitement that built over those few days was almost tangible. The night before our date, I sent a text to confirm the details. A simple message. "Excited for tomorrow. What time works best for you?" And then, nothing. No reply. I shrugged it off. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she was having second thoughts. Still, it was strange. I didn't want to seem pushy, so I waited. A day passed, then two. No word from Sarah. It wasn't like her to leave me hanging. I checked her profile again. Still up, still active, but no sign of activity on her end. I thought about reaching out, but something about it felt off. Maybe I was overthinking it. It had only been a few days after all. So I moved on. But over the next couple of weeks, I couldn't help but think about her. Was I just another guy in her endless line of matches? Had she found someone else? I asked myself all the usual questions, but none of them gave me any answers. 3 weeks passed after the silence from Sarah. I had almost completely forgotten about her when something strange happened. I was sitting at home, mindlessly scrolling through my phone when my notifications buzzed. A new message on Tinder. It was from Sarah's profile. I couldn't believe it. My heart skipped a beat. After all this time, was she finally reaching out? Maybe something had happened. Maybe she'd had a busy couple of weeks and finally found the time to reconnect. I opened the message eagerly, expecting a simple, "Hey, sorry for the silence." But what I read made my stomach drop. The message said, "You've been thinking about me, haven't you?" At first I figured someone had hacked her account. I replied quickly, "Sarah, is this you? You've been gone for weeks." No response. I waited, feeling a mix of excitement and confusion. I was on the verge of deleting the message, convinced this was some sort of prank, when my phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. This one was more unsettling. "You should have come to the cafe, but you never showed. Why didn't you show up?" I stared at the message, heart racing. She was talking about our date, but how could she know that I hadn't gone? I hadn't mentioned it to anyone, no one but my roommate, and I certainly hadn't talked to Sarah since the original silence. And even then, why was she acting like she was still alive? "Sarah," I typed cautiously, "are you okay? This doesn't make any sense. You ghosted me for weeks." There was no immediate reply, but after a few minutes my phone buzzed again. This time it was a single chilling sentence. "I'm dead." The message felt like a punch to the gut. My hands trembled as I read those 3 words over and over again. I felt a sickening chill crawl up my spine. This had to be a joke, right? Someone playing on my emotions, someone who had hacked her account. But then why the messages? Why the eerily accurate details about our date? I was trying to rationalize it all when another text came through. This one was different, shorter, simpler. Don't ignore me again. I didn't know what to think anymore. Part of me was terrified, but another part of me was still trying to find a logical explanation. I considered calling Sarah's phone, but something stopped me. What if she was really dead? What if something horrible had happened to her, and now someone was tormenting me using her identity? The thought made me nauseous. As the days passed, I received more and more messages from Sarah's account. They weren't just strange, they were unsettlingly specific. She started talking about things I hadn't shared with anyone, not even my closest friends. I know about your sister. She's been looking for you. Why did you lie about the hiking trip? You never went, did you? The messages felt invasive, like she was watching me or worse, like she had been following me for longer than I realized. I tried ignoring them, but the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. It felt like Sarah's presence was everywhere, suffocating me. I decided to look into her social media to find some answers. Maybe I could figure out what had happened, but when I searched for her name, I came across something that made my blood run cold. There was no trace of her anywhere. No recent photos, no updates, nothing after the last message I had received. I checked with mutual friends. None of them had heard from her in weeks. I was growing frantic. The lines between reality and my fear starting to blur. Who was texting me? Why was Sarah's account still active? And how was it possible that these messages were so eerily personal? My phone buzzed once again. This time the message was different. Look outside. I froze. The words on my screen felt like a jolt of ice water running down my spine. Look outside. The simplicity of it, the directness, it hit me with a rush of dread I couldn't shake. I pushed my chair back, the sound of it scraping against the floor so loud in the silence of my apartment. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with a decent view of the street below. It wasn't anything spectacular, but I could usually see the cars coming and going. The streetlights outside cast a pale glow over the pavement, giving everything an eerie glow. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Should I look? Was it some kind of prank or something far worse? I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked to the window. My phone was still in my hand, vibrating with another incoming message, but I couldn't look at it. I felt an overwhelming pull to the window, my body almost moving against my will. When I peered outside, I saw nothing at first. Just the usual, the streetlights, a few cars parked along the curb, a handful of pedestrians going about their evening. The night felt still, normal. My mind tried to convince me it was all just some elaborate, twisted joke, but that nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. I was about to turn away, about to dismiss it all, when I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure standing across the street. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, some trick of the light. But as I focused, I could make out the shape of a person, motionless, standing still. It was a woman, dressed in dark clothing, but something about her was off. She wasn't moving. Her posture was stiff, almost unnatural. It was too dark for me to make out her face clearly, but I could tell she was staring right at my building, directly up at my window. The thought hit me like a punch in the stomach. It couldn't be Sarah. Could it? I quickly pulled back from the window, heart racing. I felt lightheaded, dizzy. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it. I couldn't focus on it. I needed to process what I had just seen. Was it someone else? A coincidence? Maybe it was nothing at all, but deep down I knew better. The messages kept coming. More details, more specifics. Sarah, or whoever was sending these messages, seemed to know things about my life that no stranger should know. You like to drink your coffee black, don't you? The message read. Just like your father used to. Don't forget to check your front door. You don't want to miss it. Each message felt like it was chipping away at my sanity. I couldn't figure out how she or they knew these things. There was no way this was a coincidence. I hadn't even talked about my father in ages, and I never mentioned my strange habit of drinking black coffee. And the front door comment, what did that even mean? I started to feel paranoid. I checked the locks on all my windows and doors, despite knowing full well they were secure. I turned on every light in my apartment, even though the thought of drawing attention to myself terrified me. My eyes kept darting back to the window where I had seen the figure, but there was no one there now. I was about to message back when the phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up in my trembling hands. This time it was different. A picture. A selfie, I assumed. The image was grainy, taken with a low-quality camera, but it was unmistakably a woman's face. Her eyes were wide, staring straight into the camera, unblinking. The face was eerily familiar. It was Sarah. But there was something wrong. The skin on her face looked pale, almost ashen. Her hair, the brunette locks I remembered so clearly, looked disheveled, tangled, as if it had been days since she had last brushed it. I stared at the photo, my mouth going dry, feeling a lump form in my throat. The unsettling feeling grew stronger, the weight of it pressing against my chest. This wasn't just some random prank. I looked at the time of the picture. 1:15 a.m. It was as if she knew exactly when I would see it. That's when I made the mistake of responding. I couldn't help myself. I was terrified, but there was something about this that I couldn't ignore. How are you sending these messages? I typed, my fingers shaking. What do you want from me? I stared at the screen, waiting. The little dot at the bottom of the screen flickered a few times, indicating someone was typing, and then the response came. You don't recognize me, do you? The way you looked at me at the cafe that day. You thought I didn't notice, but I did. My stomach turned, my thoughts spinning. She was talking about the date we never had, the one where she had ghosted me, the date that never happened. But she knew everything, the little details I hadn't even told her. I sat back, heart racing. The messages kept flooding in. You took the picture of the lake last summer, remember? You said it was your favorite spot. Funny thing, I was there the same day. Funny how I never told you that, huh? And then another one, far more sinister. I know what you did to get rid of the body. You thought no one saw, but I did. I froze. The words hit me like a tidal wave. What body? What was she talking about? The blood drained from my face as I reread the message. My hands trembled, my mind racing in 1,000 different directions. What body? What was she talking about? The words repeated in my mind like an echo, too horrifying to ignore. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, to rationalize the situation. But how could I? The idea of a body, something sinister, something I had done, was unbearable. I gripped my phone harder, my knuckles white, and my mind spun into a downward spiral. I had never hurt anyone, at least not in the way the text was implying. So why was I receiving these messages? Why was I being accused of something I couldn't even understand? I threw myself onto the couch, trying to calm my breathing. The text made no sense. Sarah had never mentioned anything like that. We had barely even met. She'd ghosted me after a few days of chatting on Tinder, and that was that. I didn't have any dark secrets, no crimes lurking in my past, or so I thought. The phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. It's not too late to fix things. I'll see you soon. You'll remember what you did. A cold chill ran down my spine. The message was almost cryptic, like a threat veiled in a warning. Something about the way it was written. It didn't feel like it was coming from Sarah. Not anymore. The messages, the words, were all too pointed, too specific. It was then that a horrifying realization started to settle in. Could someone have hacked her account? Could this be a game? Some elaborate setup to mess with me? The idea felt absurd. I couldn't shake the sensation that whatever this was, it was personal. Whoever was behind these messages knew me, knew my habits, my routines. I slammed the phone down on the coffee table, my head in my hands. I had to make sense of this. I needed to figure out who was behind this, and most importantly, why. I didn't sleep much that night. The messages had drilled themselves into my thoughts, leaving me with no peace. But despite the dread gnawing at my mind, I had to get up the next morning and pretend like everything was normal. I went to work, though I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was as if every glance from a stranger made my skin crawl. My coworkers' voices felt too loud, too intrusive, and my focus was non-existent. But the worst part? Every time I checked my phone, there were new messages from Sarah's account. The texts became more cryptic, more personal, until I couldn't even recognize them as coming from the woman I once thought I knew. "I'm watching you right now. You won't get away with this. You should have stopped it when you had the chance. You'll regret it soon." That night, when I finally made it home from work, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had taken hold of me. I locked every door, checked every window, and turned on all the lights. But even with the lights blazing, I couldn't escape the sense of being watched. I kept the phone close, even though I knew it was feeding my paranoia. At 10:47 p.m., I received another message. It was a picture sent from Sarah's account again, but this time it wasn't a selfie. It was a picture of my front door, taken from across the street. I jumped out of my seat, my heart racing. Someone was outside. My mind raced through all the possibilities. It was impossible for anyone to have known where I lived, except Sarah. But she had died. She couldn't be the one standing across the street, could she? I grabbed my phone and quickly typed out a response. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The response came almost instantly. "You should have stopped me the first time. Now you'll see the truth." A sudden knock at my door made my blood run cold. I froze. I didn't know whether to open the door or call the police. The knock was firm, deliberate, almost as if whoever it was knew exactly how much fear they were instilling in me. I couldn't bring myself to move. I stayed there, paralyzed, staring at the door as if it would open by itself. Then another knock, louder this time. Thud, thud. I slowly crept toward the peephole, my hands slick with sweat. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't Sarah or anyone I recognized. It was a man, a tall, thin figure wearing a dark hoodie, standing motionless outside my door. He was facing away, his back to me, but I could feel his presence. It was suffocating. I backed away from the door, my legs weak, my pulse hammering in my chest. I considered calling the police, but something told me I had to act fast before whatever was happening escalated further. With my phone still in hand, I pulled back the curtain in the living room, trying to get a better look. The man didn't seem to notice. He stood there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. Every second felt like an eternity. I couldn't tell whether he was waiting for something or if he was just enjoying my fear. I considered messaging Sarah's account again, trying to figure out who this person was, but I hesitated. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was the man outside connected to the mysterious texts? Was he part of this game, or was he someone else entirely? Suddenly, a new message appeared on my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I couldn't stop myself from reading it. "You're not safe." And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I didn't know how much of this nightmare was real, and how much was something far more sinister than I could ever have imagined. The man outside my door had been there for what felt like hours, and I had no idea what to do. My mind raced through every possible scenario, each one more terrifying than the last. The knocking had stopped, but that only made things worse. Now there was a suffocating silence. The man stood just outside my door, completely still, as though he was waiting for something. I stared at my phone, eyes glued to the chilling message. "You're not safe." My hands shook as I typed a response. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" But there was no immediate reply. I couldn't afford to wait. The man outside my door had to be the one behind the messages, but the question remained, how did he know so much about me? How did he know about my life, my habits, even my fears? I picked up the phone and dialed 911. My voice trembled as I explained everything, trying to stay calm as I recounted the mysterious texts, the image of my front door, and the man lurking outside. The operator assured me help was on the way and told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait. But the longer I waited, the more I felt the weight of the situation pressing in on me. The air was thick with tension, and my eyes kept darting back to the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah's account. I hesitated before opening it, fearing what I would find. It read, "You should have listened to me when you had the chance. It's already too late." My heart pounded in my chest as I processed the message. Something about the words felt too final, too ominous. And then it hit me. Something I hadn't thought about before. The man outside my door. The messages. They weren't just threatening me. They were part of a game. A game someone had been orchestrating for weeks, maybe even longer. I swallowed hard, staring at the screen. Was I being stalked? By someone I once knew? Or was this all part of a twisted plan to destroy me? My stomach churned at the thought. Suddenly I heard a noise, a soft scrape against the doorframe. My blood ran cold. Someone was trying to get in. I crept toward the door, my hand on the handle, ready to defend myself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened, straining to hear any movement. The silence was maddening. But then, another sound. This time it was clear. A whisper. "I told you. You'd remember." I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. The voice came from right outside the door, but it wasn't just anyone. It was Sarah. Or rather, someone pretending to be her. It was unmistakable. The way she used to say my name, the cadence of her voice, the same soft tone. But how could it be her? How was she even here? I didn't have time to answer the question. My eyes darted to the peephole once more, and this time I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man wasn't standing still anymore. He was moving, slowly, like he was circling the house. I could hear his footsteps, soft and deliberate, as he moved closer and closer to my window. I had no choice now. I grabbed my phone and sent one final message to the account, pretending to be Sarah. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" There was a long pause, almost too long, and then the reply came. "You'll remember everything soon enough." Before I could even react, I heard a loud crash coming from the back of the house, something breaking, shattering. My heart leapt into my throat. The man was in. He was inside. I bolted toward the back door, but just as I reached for the handle, a shadow appeared in the doorway. I froze. The man was standing there blocking the only way out, and then the unthinkable happened. He spoke. "You don't know me, but I've been watching you for a long time." I didn't know what to say. I could feel my stomach drop as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How did he know me? How had he been watching me? The man stepped closer, his face still hidden in the shadows, but I could see his hands, his long fingers curled into fists. My throat went dry. I wasn't sure if he was going to hurt me or if something far worse was going to happen. Before I could react, he pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. It was a picture of me, taken in my own home. "You were never supposed to know," he whispered. "But now that you do, it's too late to turn back." I took a step back, my mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and I wished I could push them back apart. This man wasn't just some random stalker. He was someone who had been in my life before, someone who had watched me from afar. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't just being stalked by some stranger. This was all connected to Sarah, my mysterious Tinder match, the woman who had died in a car accident. But how was she still involved? How was her account still active? And then it clicked. It wasn't Sarah who had been texting me all along. It was him. The man standing before me wasn't some random guy from Tinder. He was the one who had created the fake profile. He was the one who had been messaging me, pulling the strings, manipulating everything. And Sarah? She had been nothing more than a pawn in his sick game. I looked at him, my blood running cold as the realization sunk in. This wasn't a ghost. It was a nightmare, and I had no idea how I was going to escape it.